It's very interesting the role that immigration played in the election. If we were to dial the clock back 6 months or a year before that, conventional wisdom was that a Republican primary candidate, by taking a hard line on immigration, might improve the probability of them winning the Republican primary, but would doom themselves in the ultimate November election. And the Trump campaign proved that wrong. Rob Faris, I'm the research director at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. So it's very hard to separate the media landscape from the political environment, the actions of the political elite and the electorate. They're all these days endogenous. There was a time in which there was a simpler model for understanding how these things worked. So the political elite would tell the media what they were thinking about, and this media agenda would then be passed on to the electorate through large media organizations. And now they're jointly determined, so the interests of the electorate influences the media that they watch, and hence the coverage of the media that they consume, and they both interact with political leaders. So what we see is they essentially go off and conspire together and end up in their own little social political huddles. So there have always been political campaigns launching narratives that they would like to see repeated in media. No, that's always been a part of political events and political campaigns. What we see more frequently now is you'll see narratives that bubble up from the fringes of the media ecosystems, and you'll see a lot more trial and error. There's more people throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, and there's a greater level of electorate involvement in what actually sticks and what goes viral or not. So it's less of a top-down process than it used to be. The top-down processes are still there, mind you, but they're not as strong as they used to be. Data collection and the analytical tools that we put together for this study allows us to note the differences between the different sides of the media ecosystems. And the evidence there is, we think, incontrovertible that the right wing is very different than the media that was more favored by liberals in the Clinton campaign. The right-wing media is, in general, newer media. Even Fox News, which is one of the cores of that, has been only around for 2 decades. But most of the participants are more recent than that. And they are explicitly partisan, and the behavior of the people that follow them and the data corroborate that observation. And they're just fundamentally 2 different things, and they differ kind of in the principles and the way they operate. They differ in form and substance. So it really is a fragmented media ecosystem built around polarized political lines. The center of the left is not the far left, but is what we've come to understand as center-left media. And these are large media organizations that are acting on the traditional rules and standards of journalism, which is objective journalism, telling both sides of the story, and a pretty strict line between reporting of the news and opinion and editorial. The right-wing media is not the same. They are partisan in orientation. The lines between opinion and reporting are hence not as clear. But even more than that, the number of media sources, the most prominent media sources on the right, very few of them are media organizations that came out of the traditional roles of media. So Fox News follows those rules to a certain extent. The Wall Street Journal is not even a right-wing media source any longer, as treated in this election and by the people who follow media. They're a centrist organization. And then many of the most popular media sources on the right, Daily Caller, Breitbart, Gateway Pundit, they're not traditional media organizations by any sense. They're digital natives that are highly partisan and play by different rules. The far right didn't necessarily overshadow the center right. The location in the partisan spectrum is a function of audience, and they are partisan enough that anyone who was on the right side was not receiving any attention from the left, and that's what made them far right. The reason the New York Times and the Washington Post are center left is that a majority of their attention is coming from the left, but they also have a minority but significant amount of attention coming from the right. The media organizations in the center right, which means those media organizations receiving most of their attention from the right, but also a significant amount from the left, were essentially the Never Trump crowd. It was the National Review, the Federalist, the Weekly Standard, and they were not the core of the media diet for Trump supporters. Social media is much more participatory. So when we look at the coverage through social media, it's a different subset of people that are influencing the stories that are popular in the media sources that reach greater prominence. It's hard to boil down in a few words what the success of Breitbart is due to. I think they found an available niche in conservative media that wasn't being filled already, and it was taking a harder line on immigration and appealing to the voters that ended up being Trump voters in the end. They were anti-establishment, and in an era where populist sentiments were running high, I think they capitalized on that as well. I think there are parallels in the populist messages coming out of the right and the left. Certainly the skepticism of the economic impacts, or at least the economic benefits of free trade, was a common theme across both of them, but they also parted ways on many social topics. The right was more vulnerable to disinformation because it was so highly dependent upon newer media sources that weren't following the same journalistic rules and standards. A lot of them were social media native sites that they had reached their prominence and were in the business to get clicks on social media. And being honest and accurate apparently didn't play a central part in popularity on social media. And when you're speaking to a partisan audience, they're more forgiving of the arguments put in front of them. They're less discerning, and even when you feed them something that's patently false, in some cases they may not even mind that much as long as you're singing their tune. The mainstream media was vulnerable in ways that we would never have anticipated, which is that they were chasing down stories by the traditional rules, which meant following all credible stories. And what the Trump campaign and the conservative media was very smart about was planting stories about Clinton and the various scandals that plagued her into the mainstream media effectively. The Clinton Cash book is the prime example of that. It was designed to raise questions about Clinton's integrity and raise questions of corruption with the Clinton campaign and her political dealings. And the mainstream media, being who they are, followed these stories. And the subsequent leaks of emails that came first the DNC and later the Podesta emails, they were all newsworthy, and so the mainstream media covered them all, and the net effect of all that was a large emphasis by left, center, and center media on Clinton scandals throughout the campaign. Different people have different definitions of what fake news is, and clearly distinguishing it, even if you have a clear definition, is difficult. There's always gray areas and qualitative decisions to be made in saying a given media story is this or that. If we consider fake news to be news that is entirely made up, kind of made up out of whole cloth, then there were examples of those. So one example is the Pope endorsed Donald Trump, or Hillary Clinton was funding ISIS. Those were things. There were several of those that made it onto the radar. But overall, those types of stories that were obviously fake in the made-up way of fake, very few of them were prominent amongst the stories that we tracked. A bigger problem, a bigger issue is stories that fall into the propaganda, misinformation, disinformation camp, and that made up a much, much greater amount of the coverage of the election campaign.